Okay, so the first muscle group I'll be talking about is the iliopsoas muscle group, which is located in your hip. The origin is in the inner part of the ilium and also on the lumbar vertebrae. And then the insertion is on the lesser trochanter of the femur, which is located medially and posteriorly, which is right about here under the neck of the femur. And the iliopsoas group concentrically contracts to perform hip flexion, so like this. And then its eccentric contraction is hip extension, or it controls hip extension against resistance. So when you're extending against resistance is when it eccentrically is contracting, and it acts as an antagonist when when you are extending your hip like regularly without any resistance. So if you're just extending your hip, that's when the iliopsoas group is acting as an antagonist. Alright, the next muscle I'll be talking about is the tensor fascia latae, and it is originated on the front of the iliac crest right about here. And then its insertion is on the lateral side of the thigh, about 2/3 of the way down, so I'd say about here. And then its concentric action it would be abduction, so of the hip. And then the eccentric contraction would be adduction with it'd be controlling adduction with resistance. So slowly, like you'd have a tear band around your ankles, and then you slowly, with resistance, adduct. And then the muscle action that the tensor fascia latae would act as a antagonist would be just without resistance hip adduction. So once you're here to here. Now I'll talk about the muscle known as the sartorius, which its origin is at the front inferior spine, iliac spine, which is right around here. And the insertion is at the patella, the base of the patella, and the patellar ligament to the tibial tuberosity, so right in this area. And its primary concentric contraction is hip flexion. So helps when you do this. And then its primary eccentric contraction is to control hip extension when there's resistance. So you're already here, and with resistance you're going up. And then its antagonist movement, where the sartorius is acting as an antagonist, is regular hip extension with no resistance. The next muscles I'll be talking about are the hamstring muscles. There are 3 of them: the biceps femoris, the semimembranosus, and the semitendinosus. So all 3 have the same origin, which is the ischial tuberosity, or the bony part that you usually sit on, right here. And then they have different insertions. So the biceps femoris insertion is on the lateral side of the tibial, or of the condyle of the tibia, or near the fibular head. And then the semimembranosus insertion is on the posterior side of the medial condyle of the tibia. And then the semitendinosus insertion is on the anterior side of the medial condyle of the tibia. And For the group of hamstring muscles, the primary concentric contraction is for hip extension. So you're here, and then they help extend your hips. And the primary eccentric contraction is hip flexion with resistance. So you have resistance and you slowly go down and your hamstrings are eccentrically contracting. And then your hamstring muscles act as antagonists just with regular hip flexion with no resistance. Alright, the next muscle I'll talk about is the gluteus maximus. The origin is on the gluteal line of the ilium, which is here, as well as the lower parts of the sacrum and coccyx. And then the insertion is on the gluteal line of the femur and the iliotibial band of the tensor fascia latae. And then the primary concentric contraction of the gluteus maximus is hip extension. So helps you extend your hips. And then the primary eccentric contraction is hip flexion with resistance. It helps control flexion with resistance. So with resistance, it's eccentrically contracting your gluteus maximus, and then the gluteus maximus will act as an antagonist muscle during regular hip flexion with no resistance. The next muscle I'll talk about is the gluteus medius. So the origin for that is on the outer surface of the ilium, right under the crest, and then the insertion for that is on the greater trochanter on the middle surface on the femur. The primary concentric contraction for this is abduction. So it helps abduct our hips, and then their eccentric contraction is to control adduction with resistance, so of the hips, so that or going down, and then it will act as it'll act as an antagonist when it is just doing regular adduction with no resistance. The next group of muscles I'll talk about is the hip adductors. So the origin there are 5 of them, and the origin for all 5 are on the front of the pubis of the hip bone. And the names of the 5 muscles are the pectineus, the adductor brevis, the adductor magnus, the adductor longus, and the gracilis. So the pectineus inserts in between the lesser trochanter of the femur and the linea aspera of the femur, so right around here. And then the adductor brevis inserts at the lesser trochanter. Both adductor longus and magnus insert on the linea aspera, and then the gracilis inserts on the medial condyle, just below the medial condyle of the tibia. So for their primary concentric contraction is obviously hip adduction. That's why they're called the hip adductors. And then the primary eccentric contraction would be hip abduction with resistance. So it controls abduction with resistance. So it's like you had a tear band on your ankles and you're slowly against the resistance going up. And then finally the hip adductors would act as antagonists while doing regular hip abduction with no resistance. Right, this muscle that I'm talking about is the rectus femoris, and the origin of it is on the iliac spine on the anterior portion, and the insertion is at the base of the patella. The primary concentric contraction for it is hip flexion, and then the primary eccentric contraction would be controlling hip extension. And then the rectus femoris would act as an antagonist during regular hip extension with no resistance. Now, these are the 6 deep external rotators, which originate at the front of the sacrum and the back of the ischium. And the insertion is a posterior and superior portion of the greater trochanter on the femur. Their primary concentric contraction is external rotation, which is why they're called the external rotators. Their eccentric primary contraction is controlling internal rotation with the resistance of the hips. And then they would act as antagonists during regular internal hip rotation with no resistance. So now I'll talk about the quadriceps muscle group, which consists of the rectus femoris and the vasti muscle group. I've already discussed about the rectus femoris, but the vasti muscle group consists of the vastus lateralis, intermedialis, and medialis. And the vastus lateralis originates on the linear aspect of the lateral aspect of the linea aspera on the femur, and the vastus intermedialis originates on the front of the middle of the femur on the upper 2/3 aspect of it, and then the vastus medialis originates on the medial aspect of the linea aspera, and all 3 of them insert at the upper border of the patella and patellar ligament. The primary concentric contraction for the quadriceps muscle group is knee extension, and the primary eccentric contraction would be controlling knee flexion with resistance. And the quadriceps muscle group would act as a primary antagonist during regular knee flexion with no resistance.